glad to be with everybody and have this opportunity to talk to you. I'm Judy Bandy. I'm previously a school nurse that worked in the middle school for about 10 years, and that's where I grew my passion around ADHD and executive functions. Did a lot of work there with kids and with parents and teachers. We developed a learning lab to help our kids there, and then I now coach and do trainings like this. So I'm thrilled to be here and appreciate all of you who are wanting to learn more about ADHD and executive functions. I really believe in Ross Green's statement, children do well if they can, not if they want to. And our explanation can really guide our interventions. And that's what I learned when I began to see ADHD differently. It certainly changed how we were able to come to it. The biggest thing about ADHD is to understand that it's not really about attention. It's about a developmental delay in the brain's inhibitory system, which is what helps us self-regulate ourselves, which results in these issues with executive functions. So that's why they can pay attention fine with what they're interested in. Most of our self-regulation has to happen when we have to do something we don't want to do. I do want to mention that it's often missed in girls. The distraction can be more social, inattention is often more prominent, more anxiety. They really are sensing they're not kind of keeping up. And so sometimes girls are often diagnosed later, like even high school or college. And it's important to kind of think through that when you're thinking about your daughters or the girls you're working with. I'm going to just show you a couple things about the brain that I think are important to understand. This study was done by the National Institute of Mental Health. These are brain scans that were done on a group of kids. The bottom row is your typical brains, and ADHD's top. And what you're looking here is at the thickness of the cortex. So the really dark shaded area is how thick the cortex is. You can see the ADHD brains are delayed in how thick the cortex gets, which is where a lot of this neuron activity happens. And that's one of the brain changes that we see in kids with ADHD. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on medication tonight, but I do want you to understand the system and why meds are given or could be given for ADHD. Neurons are not connected to one another. Neurotransmitters, which are these little red dots, have to pass the messages from cell to cell. So this cell releases the chemicals and this cell takes it and passes it on. We also have reuptake cells. These are like vacuum cleaner cells that pull the chemicals back up into the cell to be used for the next message to come through. ADHD brains, some say they have more reuptake cells or these work faster, whatever is going on. There is not as much dopamine and norepinephrine in their synapse, in the gap between their cells. And the way medicine works is to block these. So it would say dopamine reuptake inhibitor. You're simply kind of stop gapping that to try to give kids enough dopamine. We're going to spend most of our time today talking about executive functions. And I want you to think of them as sort of the command and control center part of our brain. And they help us. They do things to ourselves, we manage ourselves to get to our goal. And they're primarily in our prefrontal cortex. So this is kind of a picture of the brain and the prefrontal cortex. This part right up here is our command and control center. And what it has to do is coordinate with all the parts of our brain. So it has to coordinate with our what network, to thinking to guide our behavior. It has to coordinate with our why network, which is our emotions and our motivation and managing our impulsivity. It has to communicate with the self-monitoring network part of our brain, which is my awareness of me doing what I need to do. And it has to communicate with my timing network. So all of this activity is happening kind of in the prefrontal cortex, but it's really communicating with all of these parts of the brain. They develop over time. So babies are born with no executive function ability, right? Everything has to be externally driven for them, till we gradually can become more internally driven, and our mental and our mind can guide our behavior rather than even others guiding our behavior. We can begin to regulate our own behavior. I can begin to anticipate the future and delay my gratification. But this is a continuum over time of how all of these skills develop. And what's important to understand around ADHD is that these are delayed. ADHD is not abnormal behavior, it's immature behavior. And it can feel a little bit like it's not very normal because you can have a child struggling at their age, but it's really typical behavior for a younger age. And typically they say the delay is about a third of their age. So this is just a graph to show often what you're experiencing is that just doesn't seem like their skills quite are keeping up with what their chronological age. A couple things to note is that people often ask, well, does this ever catch up? Well, it does in the sense that our brains fully develop at 30. We used to think 25. Insurance rates always go down at 25 because this prefrontal cortex develops, but it can even be up to 30. And so that gap doesn't seem as big often at 30 and 25. And ADHD, a third of adults will kind of outgrow symptoms. A third of adults will say they've outgrown it, but there's still kind of remnants of some of the ADHD, but it's not too impairing. And some adults can struggle with it, even as an adult. And I think what's important to note is sometimes in the middle school years, or high school years, it seems like it's getting worse. And what's happening is that developmental delay is bigger because what's being expected is more. And teachers and everybody are teaching to the executive function needs of their age, like a 12-year-old, but they're not, a middle school teacher isn't necessarily supporting executive functions age of like an 8-year-old. It's also really important to know that environment changes the expression of ADHD symptoms. So that's why some of the inconsistency of it can be difficult to understand. But if something is more fun, it's going to be better because the inhibitory system doesn't have to work as hard. Where it's worse is where their inhibitory system has to work harder. So when they're in a group or later in the day, or it's more unregulated time, they may have more trouble. So let's talk about executive functions. I want you to think of these as a pyramid. And the first two that really develop are self-awareness and our inhibitory system. Metacognition, which is self-awareness, is helping me understand what I'm doing, thinking about what I'm doing, and adjusting to reach my goal. So I'm going to read the environment, I'm going to read what I have to do, I'm going to read my time to figure out if I'm where I'm at. So an elementary child, this may show up in a social setting. One way may be where Jane's outside playing and riding scooters with her two friends, and her friends said they're tired and want to go inside, but Jane just keeps riding. Her friends sigh, they sit down, and Jane isn't reading the cue. They finally kind of go in, and Jane's frustrated. She doesn't get the social cues. A teen, and this is these are actually true examples, but a teen told his mom he had a science test on Friday and he needed to know 5 facts. Mom was impressed that he'd remembered the test, but in fact, what happened on Monday was he needed to write a 5-paragraph essay, which they had been working on for 2 weeks in class. So the 5 paragraphs was what he was needed, and he thought it was 5 facts. So in school, you'll see kids make careless mistakes. They'll be genuinely surprised about feedback. They may have poor oral fluency. They're not kind of tracking how they're reading, or they'll miss parts of directions, that metacognition. Inhibition or self-control is the ability to be able to stop, just stop. So can I stop and control my attention? Can I stop and control my impulses? And can I stop a task to start another task? That's why transitions are so hard. They have to pull off of what's interesting and attach to what's not. And my inhibitory system has to help me do that. So an elementary age child will could get distracted getting ready for bed. They may not be able to sit still at dinner. They may be just really fidgety and they may be more accident prone. They may interrupt more. A teen may have a hard time getting off video game. The distractions of technology can be quite tricky. There can be, they're not managing their emotions. So there's anger and emotional outbursts, and they may have more driving accidents. So in school, you see this self-dysregulation, the blurting. They don't use class time well often in a boring class because they're not able to get started. They're not able to stop doing what's interesting. Or they may feel like, I just got to get this done. I don't want to have to transition because I got to get this done first. Physical space may be difficult to respect. And they may be generally confused about what's going on or ask a question where you just explained it because they've missed it. Working memory is the next thing that kind of has to work. So if I can know what I'm doing and be aware and remember it, then I can remember and manage my impulses. I can remember it. And working memory is really keeping information in mind. So when I go downstairs and can't remember what I'm going to get out of the freezer, my working memories let me down. And so an elementary child, this happened. Sam went into the bathroom to wash his hands before dinner, and when he went in there, he couldn't remember what he was there for, so he brushed his teeth. And, you know, Jill may need to know she needs to pick up some milk and snacks on her way home from school, but the gas light goes on. She pulls into the gas station, totally forgets that she was going to go get milk. And in school, you see them forgetting instructions. Math facts for kids can be really hard if there's working memory issues for some kids, if math is not interesting. They may find themselves on the page and can't remember what they've read, not because they're not good readers, but because their attention and working memory haven't worked for them. They can also get really stuck writing ideas down. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Time management is another executive function. So can they sense and use time to get things done by deadlines? Oftentimes kids with ADHD, their sense of time is not there. I've heard time explained sort of like the banks of a river. And as I'm going down the creek, do I have a sense? Do I need to speed up? Where am I at in my day? And they're kind of our floodgates, like there's no banks to that river for them. So you can have kids, you know, an elementary age child really may want to be read to at night and they need to get through their shower in 15 minutes or out of the bathroom and they're late. They just don't manage that time. You have kids that have projects that are assigned over time. And he thinks 2 weeks is a lot of time. Like he thinks that's like, you know, plenty of time. But the night before he starts the project, he realized he needed to collect data for 5 days first. So he's failing the class, knows he can't get it done, and he just gives up in video games. So you see this time management in school. Assignments are turned in late. They'll be surprised about how something long takes. They may arrive late to school. They may not finish a test, or they may rush. Emotional self-control is our ability to manage our feelings to be successful and get things done. And this requires me to be aware, to be able to manage my impulses, to bring in mind my working memory and kind of talk to myself about what's going on to regulate my emotions. So these kids and people are easily excitable. They can also be easily frustrated. You'll have some expressive, you know, emotions. They often can be very easily overwhelmed and they just shut down. And it can seem to the outsider that it seems like sort of a little step where they're shut down, but it's real to them. They can wear their emotions on their sleeve sometimes. And the interesting thing that you have to decipher a little bit with these kids is the emotional regulation. These kids can also struggle with anxiety and depression. But ADHD dysregulation is sort of the emotions are up and out and they've moved on. And it can be over an incident that makes sense. They can be really overwhelmed. Something didn't get done, but they're not regulating it. Whereas kids with more anxiety and depression, that's more underlying. And then there's self-motivation and goal-directed persistence. So it's finding the reason to do something and being able to stick with it when it's done. I think motivation is probably one of the biggest things that we misunderstand. It appears they could be lazy or don't care, and I have not seen a kid that wants to fail. So I think what's important to understand is that motivation I have to use when I have to do something non-preferred. And we know the system lets these kids down when they have to do something non-preferred. So to show motivation, I have to be able to get started and sustain my attention and persist and be able to kind of plow through it. And it's harder for these kids to do that. And so they'll give up easier and they really have a hard time why they're going to do something. And if they don't have that link, it can be tricky for them. Organization, we know that that's also often hard for these kids, and can they maintain a system to find things and organize their thoughts as well. So it isn't just stuff, it's their work and their thoughts. So you have kids that leave a trail behind them everywhere they go, and their backpack is crumpled papers. I often, said working in the learning lab, we needed an iron to iron out these crumpled papers. They lose stuff. And the other thing that can sometimes happen with kids, like this teen has a science experiment and he starts an idea and then he has another idea and then he has another idea. He can't organize and get around one thing. And in school, if they're in school using papers, you'll see them lose them, but you can see them lose them electronically too. They don't have a system on their device that organizes their papers. And that can be both ways. They're having trouble. You'll see disorganization in writing and connecting information, so that can be difficult. And then there's planning and problem solving. So it's really making a roadmap to accomplish something and adjusting along the way as needed. And I can't stress enough how these kids can get stuck. And it's surprising sometimes that they don't see the next step, but helping them find that can be really helpful. Jen seems to always sit down at the dinner table and start eating before everyone's ready. Her parents have told her over and over to wait. She has no idea what to do. Jen couldn't really consider what she could do instead of sitting at the table. So what would be some of those activities that could take up her time? It's Tuesday. Matt's 12 missing assignments. His mom said they have to be done to be at a best friend's birthday party on Saturday. Matt's so discouraged that he won't be able to go to the party. This is one of the kids I worked with in lab. He was in tears. He couldn't consider that some of them were done. He has time to get them done. He can talk to teachers, where he's stuck, but it just all of a sudden is impossible. So these kids sometimes will show poor deductive reasoning. They have a harder time sometimes connecting cause and effect. We've talked about how they can be disorganized in writing and organizing or sequencing their information. And, it's hard for some assignments or test questions that require more than, require using the facts to give the answer and not just state the facts. Flexibility I put in here, it's also an executive function, which is, it really uses all the executive functions, but can they change and adapt and see other sides of the situation? And some kids are extremely flexible, and everybody has strengths and weaknesses within this pile of executive functions, and that's important to remember. But the inflexible kids that have trouble, recovering, they get frustrated with redirection, they have a hard time shifting gear. Open-ended assignments can be really frustrating for them, and it's even hard for them to redirect. So I want you to think of this, these executive functions kind of on a pyramid, and we can show our abilities and talents when our executive functions support us. So when I can stop and think and get started and focus and be aware and use my working memory to remember things or manipulate information in reading and writing or guiding my behavior, manage my time, stay motivated, and problem solve, I can show what I know. But what happens is these kids often are termed underachieving because their executive functions don't line up. They'll line up on things they're interested in. They may not line up on things they're not. And that's kind of what we see. So I'm going to pause for a minute for some questions about executive functions, and then we're going to get into some strategies and ways to think about it around the executive functions. Are there any questions so far?
I don't have any that have been chatted into me yet.
Okay, then I'll keep going. So the challenge for the adults working with these kids is you have to kind of be an executive function detective. You have to start wondering what executive function is letting them down and begin to strategize from there. So I just want to show you all the different things that can happen. So the mornings are just crazy in our house. My son takes forever to wake up. Have to go in 4 or 5 times to get out of bed. He goes into the bathroom. If he makes it back to his room, I go in and he's not getting dressed. He's playing with his stuffed animals. He finally gets dressed and comes down for breakfast. He takes too long to eat, doesn't brush his teeth, and he forgets his backpack. As we hop in the car, we're both yelling at each other. So if you think about all the things that could be going on here, he's very tired in the morning. What are his sleep habits like? A lot of kids do not have, they have sleep difficulties. Time management is needed throughout the whole morning. There's so much executive function that works to get out the door. So they have to manage their time both in the bathroom, getting dressed, eating. They have to remember what they have to do. And sometimes they're forgetting the simplest of things, it seems. They have to start and stop a lot. So they have transitions all the way along the way where I have to stop and and start. I have to stay focused in the areas, wherever I am. And I have to understand myself in the routine. So I have to understand I'm running late. I have to read the cue that mom's given me, the third prompt, and all of that. And I have to try to stay calm through it all. And I have to want to go to school. So some of these kids, maybe there's a reason they don't want to get to school. This is being an executive function detective. And I know that it seems a little bit overwhelming sometimes, all the things we have to think about. But in the kids I work with, this is where you have to go to figure out where it is in this process that he's having the most trouble, and then try to build some strategies around it. So I think the fundamentals of executive function support are twofold. The adult working with the kids has to stay calm to the best that we can. We have to be able to access our executive functions. And when we stay calm, it can shift things, and it's important to do that. We need to remember our kids' strengths and their interests, because they need places where they're also successful and thriving, and they are created with those. We have to try to figure out building our relationship with them beyond what just needs done. We also are a safety net, and we have to advocate, and we have to keep showing this unconditional support. This is a journey of getting through, and these are the foundational things that need to happen to get everybody through. Skills have to be taught and reinforced. They will not just get it. We have to remember their age, what's fair to expect, and try to work with the child for solutions. So that's kind of fundamentally, as an adult, the stance that I have found is so helpful. In terms of looking at executive functions, we have to externalize which one is not working because their brain isn't doing it. We have to figure out the plan, how they're going to remember, how they're going to use time, what is their motivation. And if we get the plan in place and it's working, the key is to pull support gradually. So pull one step of the support at a time. If you pull it too quickly, they may go back to baseline because their executive functions still aren't able to support them. And we always have to remember the point of performance. Point of performance is simply in the moment and in the space where they need to access information, we have to have a reminder. So if you say to your child, after dinner, unload the dishwasher. Everybody eats. If there's not a reminder for him in that moment to unload the dishwasher, he may forget if it's not a habit. If he has to talk to a teacher about something tomorrow, how can something pop up on his device or on his phone when he walks into math class at 3:03, that's when he has to access what he was going to do, and make sure we write down what he was going to ask the teacher, because they may forget that. So whatever you're doing, you have to build in, how are you going to remember that when you need it? So let's talk a little bit about inhibition and self-control strategies. So remember, this is the ability to kind of stop, get started, and control our attention. I encourage adults to give kids a quick second chance. Parents often say to me, they just lie. They just lie to me. And they are, in the sense, lying, but sometimes what you're getting is an unfiltered response that they haven't thought about. They may be self-protecting themselves, or they may plan on taking care of it later and just don't really want to get into discussion. So try to rephrase the question. Try to say, I'm going to ask that again. I want you to think about it. I'm going to count to 5. And if they self-correct it, then praise that and thank them for that. Also try to ask a question in a way to build a pause. I want you to go up to your room and I want you to see, I want you to go up to, sorry about that. I want you to go up to the room and see what needs picked up in your room. Or whatever, you try to, or open up your computer and let's, look at what you've got. Don't just say, do you have homework? No, they'll get. So try to ask questions in a way that create them to have to look for something. I also think it's really important to tell them what you know. Avoid asking a question to see if they'll tell you the truth. So I had a student I worked with a while back at school, and his mom said there was so much conflict at home when I talk to him about it, and I did. And he said, well, it's my mother. And I said, well, what about your mom? And he said, she asks me questions she knows the answers to. she'll say, we need to talk. Do you have missing assignments? She knows I have missing assignments. Why can't she say, let's just talk about our missing assignments? So if you know something didn't go well for them, I just talked to a mom this week that said, she knew it, she didn't do well on a test, and asked her daughter how she did on her test. And she didn't, really didn't say how she did on it. And so that's kind of setting it up for communication that may not be helpful. You can try to give them cues to stop and think or change behavior. So if they get, if they're getting impulsive or misbehave in a certain setting, if you can have a cue before you go in and they know what that means to try to jog their memory. I know that's not always easy. Practice delayed gratification. Say, set a timer in a minute, I'll do that. Practice having them wait a little bit. Catch them being good. Set up a tally chart of where you see them self-regulating, or where you see them adjusting themselves, or where you see them transitioning when you've asked. And then after 5 tally marks, let it be worth something. Deep breathing can help everybody. Headsets to block out distractions. A lot of people will say, can they really work while they're listening to music? And background music, they can. Sometimes it blocks out everything else. Give the most feedback you can to kids, but use the least amount of words you can. And remember, kids may need to move to focus, and they have a need to move. The one thing I didn't say about the brain scans at the beginning that I showed you with the cortexes that weren't so thick, in that study, the motor system of the brains on some kids was overdeveloped. So we have this little motor system working extra with a brake system that can't work. Behavioral charts can be used at schools. Sometimes they're used at home. I think you need to have them be as specific as you can. So it needs to just be really specific. Like a student brings a notebook and a folder to class. The students get out of bed with one reminder. The student stops math and starts reading, whatever it is. And they need to understand the baseline. Kids won't often be aware of how many times it's not working. So can you help them, ask them that question? And I always have kids rate themselves on these. How did you do with it on a scale of 1 to 5? And if there's discrepancy, that's a place of that metacognition that we have to talk about it. And sometimes if it's something at school, you can do reward at home. Transitional signs can be really helpful, particularly for younger kids. So you can just put up the stop sign. You can put up like detour ahead or change direction. We've got a couple different ways we can go. Which way are you going to go? Those can be helpful to alert, to stop and think about what you're going to do. This was a chart I did with a child that couldn't stop playing Legos at night. He was so creative. And we talked about expected and unexpected. So expected would be at the time he would go up the stairs, he would be able to keep his emotions intact. So this is kind of a signal for a lid flipping. This is our emotion center. And when our prefrontal cortex can think, we can keep it calmed down. When our lid flips, it goes, then we're mad or explosive or upset. And what he could say to himself was, what did I build tonight? I will stop even if I'm not done. And he was going to earn some money. What would be unexpected is if he would keep building and his lid would flip. And these would be the things he would tell him. So it was sort of like alert, stop. Which way are you going to go? And then you kind of know which way they're going, right? If you give them the pause, they're not just kind of impulsively reacting. They've thought about it. One of the things that's important to understand for kids, particularly getting started on homework, is why they're stuck. And these are different characters that this author talks about, but I think it's important to remember. So people can be like Homer Simpson, who just never prioritizes all day long. And, busy, but at the end of the day, he's kind of going, didn't get done what I wanted to. Winnie the Pooh are forgetful. They just forget about it. Doug the dog in the movie Up gets distracted. The Seven Dwarfs can get really overwhelmed. Or there's some kids that are perfectionists. And if they can't get it done right, perfect the first time, they have a hard time doing it at all. And kids can scale this. You can ask them on a 1 to 5, what happened? And that's really important, because the way you strategize around prioritizing versus forgetting versus being overwhelmed are all different. And we've got to know what it is. This comes from Jennifer Wilkin Deaton. And if I have any teachers, she actually showed this in a classroom setting to help transition. But so there's two different ways to do this. In a classroom, she had a box with 3 subdivision boxes in it, and she would do check marks for each of these warnings so kids could kind of know if a transition was coming. At home, you can give kids something, but basically what you're doing is priming the pump. So you're going to them or stopping the class and saying, in 10 minutes, we're going to go, we're going to stop reading and come to dinner. We're going to stop reading and you're going to get your math book out. And you ask them to repeat it. Then you give them a token or a Post-it note or a check mark in a classroom. 5 minutes, you do the same thing. And you say, now, what was it? Okay, everybody's got that. And then when it's time to come. And you want them to eventually be able to do this on their own. I understand that, but sometimes they have to have these warnings of what's coming ahead. And if a teacher wants, or anybody wants more information, let me know, or a teacher, I can be even more specific about it if you let me know. Sometimes kids really respond to if then. So if I do this, then I'm going to do this. And you have a picture of it, or you have a visual of it. So that's their choice. I'm going to explain a get ready, do done model by Sarah Ward. And basically this is breaking out what has to get done. So you start with, what does done look like? And I'm going to give you an example of this. And then I have kids give me a procrastination quotient on a scale of 1 to 5, how much you're going to procrastinate it. So maybe it's a 5. Then what happens is I want to know what steps, what we have to do. We're going to kind of list it out, what has to be done. And what do I need to do to get started? And why will I do it? So this is the reward I'll get. And then you can give yourself a second procrastination and see if it goes down any. So then you do it. You manage your time, and then you close it in and get it done. So let me show you an example of this. So I have math homework to complete. I'm at a 4. I do not want to do it. I have to do 10 problems, and I think it's going to take me about 45 minutes. I have to open up my iPad. I'm going to go to the kitchen table. I'm going to start at 5 o'clock, and I'm going to put my earbuds in to work. And I'm going to get electronic time when I'm done. Now I'm at a 2. I don't really want to do it, but I think I can do it. I've looked at it, I understand it, and I can do it. And I have figured out where to get started. Like when I'm stuck, this is what I'm going to do, and then I'll be able to get going. And so then I submit it in the Dropbox, and I get my electronic time. I think that one of the things that's interesting is the get ready stage can be really helpful to think about. I had worked with somebody that needed to clean up their room, and she said the first thing I had to do was go get the garbage bag. Like what's the very first step sometimes can get them going. This is a picture, in a classroom of something they were going to make, some slime or something, and what they needed to do and what they were going to do to get ready. So just kind of overall with getting started, try to get the plan, prioritize on what's that first step that seems very doable, and divide them. You can divide the steps even up on Post-it notes or cards if they're overwhelmed, and reward if you can when you're done, and and again, timing the task, or working so many minutes, then take a break, time the break, and get back to work. These bands on desks can be really helpful for self-regulation. That their feet can swing and move, and it's not really loud. A stand-up desk can be really helpful for kids. Sitting on a ball or sitting on one of these things that can move is another thing that can be helpful for self-regulation. I'm going to talk a little bit about metacognition, and then we'll stop for some questions if there's any. Metacognition is helping notice how you're doing. Building not metacognition is seeking understanding and trying to see what they see and what they know. And it takes patience and it takes curiosity from us. So I think we have to avoid the why questions. We need to ask more about what and how. We can ask kids to scale when they can't do anything else or can't tell you anything. Often they can scale if we can get specific enough. So how much of you not getting your room poked up is that you got distracted? You got frustrated and wanted to do something else. You forgot. You didn't know what to do with stuff. And they'll say 1, 5, 3. They can sometimes tell you that. You know, how much of you not getting the math done is that you don't understand it. You forgot. You're distracted. You're lost of time. You started but couldn't finish. How much did you follow the directions and complete the tasks? And if they don't give you an answer, you can always say, I have a hunch. I'm wondering, how close am I? And I think when you're really seeking understanding, and kids know you're in that space, they can tell you. I had a student I recently worked with, and I just realized how specific I had to get in my questions. He wasn't really wanting to take his medication. And so I said, what's that about? You know, and some kids will just tell you at that point. I don't know, he says. I said, well, you know, some kids tell me they don't like the way they feel on it, or their friends tell them they don't really, they can tell they're not as fun, or they don't eat, or they just really don't want to take a med. They don't want to have to need anything. He said, I don't know. And so I said, okay, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much of it is that you don't like how you feel? 1. How much of it is that friends have said something to you about it? 3. How much of it is you really don't want to have to take anything? 5. How much of it is, you have a side effect? 0. Okay, now I knew. Now I knew what we could process. But it's so easy to just stop at the I don't know. Another example of this was 2 kids that could not get off their technology. One had to go to hockey and one had to go to football. They were junior hires. I was working with them, and it was just so hard to get them out the door to these 2 things. And I, even as much as I've worked with this, I kind of quickly said, they just can't transition. They can't inhibit to get going. And so we were working on some strategies around that. But fortunately, I stopped and said, the kid that went to hockey loved hockey. The kid that went to football, I said, do you like football once you're there? He goes, no, not really. I go, really? And he said, well, I don't have any friends there. Well, now part of him not going was that. But if I hadn't stopped to ask it, we wouldn't know it. So help build metacognition by asking questions. Give praise for specific things when you see them do something. Be very specific and be kind of a drive-by compliment. Mothers and fathers can, or especially mothers often can talk too much, but be specific. Or, I noticed your helpfulness when you helped your sister find her coat. Link your encouragement to something you see in them and their character. Helping kids know what finished looks like can help metacognition. So what's the picture of the clean room? What's the picture of the organized backpack? Can we see an example of a project of what it looks like when it's done? Asking kids, what is your next step? What's working? What have you tried? What didn't work? What could you do different? Have them think about that if you can. If you make a plan, what are you finding about following the plan we made? Because a lot of times they have to be changed. For social situations, you can make guesses with your child regarding a situation on the TV or in the store if they have trouble reading social cues. It's just really important to pause and come alongside your kids and see what their perception is. This is a wheel that I use around what's behind missing assignments, because it can be any of these things. It can be they didn't understand it, they ran out of time, they forgot about it, they didn't have what they needed. They completed it, but it's not handed in. They get started but couldn't finish. They couldn't even get started. They get distracted. They lose it. If they have dysgraphia, which a lot of these kids can, and they have to handwrite something, that will stop them that will just stop them in their tracks from getting it done. And this will depend by subject. When I do this with kids, they'll say, science, I don't understand it. Math, I just don't get it handed in. I mean, whatever. So it can be, by subject. These devices can be helpful to prompt kids to self-monitor or stay on task. So the motivator is something that goes in the pocket, and it's to help people change habits, and so it will vibrate and kind of remind you of what you're supposed to do. The Revive watch is a watch that you tap if you're on task or off task. You tap once if you're on and 2 if you're off. And it kind of tracks you through the day, and it will adjust how often it needs to vibrate. So if you're on, I bought one to kind of try it out for myself. And if, like if I'm on task a fair amount, it kind of extends how often it's vibrating. If I'm not on task, because I just tried it, it would vibrate a little sooner, and you can kind of see it read out. So if they're willing to try it, there's been some success with those things. So that's the first few executive functions. We have a few more to go over, but I'm happy for questions if there's any.
Yeah, it looks like we have a few that have come in. The first one is from Amy, and it says, would taking all day to clean her room be an example of having poor executive function?
Yes.
Okay. So
I think what you're probably seeing is distraction. Like they're just looking at one thing that leads them to another, that leads them to another, totally losing track of time. Could be overwhelmed. Like it's gotten to be such a mess that it's hard to know where to start, So that would be, that would be an example.
Okay. The next one is from a different Amy. It says, do you find that many teachers are trained in dealing with children that have ADHD? I feel like I'm constantly repeating myself.
I think that's a really good question. I think teachers try their best. I think that they often, I think some of them have not been trained in it to understand the executive function piece of it. And I think the challenge with ADHD and executive function, it's sort of the underlying problem all the time. Just teaching the executive function skill isn't always enough. They have to have the reminder to use it. So I can teach them in an organizational system, but will they use it in the time and space? And so that can be tricky for teachers. But I find that when you explain, especially when kids, and I didn't do it very much on self-advocacy, but if I have time at the end of this, I'll talk about it. I think helping kids explain to their teachers what their experience is, what's easy for them, what's hard for them, can really be helpful to teachers.
There's one that just popped in that's sort of along that same line, so I'll read that one next from Susan. It says, what are some good techniques to use in talking to a teacher about ADHD? What is the most important point? I would say the most important point is a developmental delay. That everybody understands that this child is struggling to do what their peers do with the amount of support that their peers are having. And that I think helping them know what you're doing at home, because parents often are jumping through so many hoops. They're working so hard to get done what you can get done or get them to school and, with what they need to. And maybe try to be specific, like 1 or 2 things that might really make a difference. If you can get some kind of a behavioral plan that you're willing to reward at home, that's a good partner. I don't know the age of the kids, so it's a little tricky, but. All right, next question is from Sonia. It says, is ADD still a category or is it only ADHD? Yeah, good question. And so now it's ADHD, and then it's either hyperactive presentation, combined presentation, or inattentive presentation. And what they know is it's really all one disorder in a sense. And even as time goes on, hyperactivity sometimes wanes. There may be some restlessness, and then, but you know, the inattention can be. So it is sort of subtyped like that now.
Right. The next question is from Jules. It says, is there a good way to help develop an inner monologue earlier?
A what?
An inner monologue.
Oh, that's a great question. I think the more you do with the metacognition and even stopping and asking them what they're thinking and what their next step is, it has to be externalized first, I think. But I think the more discussion around that and having them think about why they did it or what they were thinking, if they were thinking at all, how they can stop and think. But I think it's also a developmental deal. But I think the more you can get them to kind of talk about it, and maybe have some cues for them to stop and think, you know, up on their desk or whatever.
All right. The next question is from Laura, and it says, when we are constantly managing and correcting and redirecting, it can be very hard to improve the relationship with the kid. They are suspicious of a calm or happy moment. How can we start the relationship healing?
So I run a mindful parenting group that I'm starting one next week, and we talk about this a lot. I think being honest with them is the best place to be. You know, like I realize I don't want to be correcting all the time. I don't want this. And they have to trust it. I mean, you have to do it enough a little bit that it's trustable. And I think one thing you can do, and kids will like kind of roll their eyes, but you know, you can say, for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to do whatever you want to do. You know, whatever it is. I mean, I did that once with my 7th grader, and I had to play this video game, and I had no idea what I was doing, but it was, it was fine. Or, you just say, I'm going to take you out for an hour and we can go wherever you want to go. So you just really key into just having there be no agenda to it. I think also just writing encouragement, putting a little Post-it note up or texting them something, and they're going to wonder what happened. They are going to kind of wonder. And I can remember, my kids going, did you go to another parenting workshop? When I would try something new, but you just are honest with them that you're trying to change the pattern a little bit.
A similar question about the reminders and the Post-its. First part of the question is, are the tokens or Post-it notes to serve as a tangible reminder for the kids? And also, similarly from another person, can we go too far with the reminders? I feel like we have reminders all over the house, morning routine, night routine, etc. Am I making things worse or better?
Well, you can, you can't do too much. I think part of it is deciding so Ross Green has some great stuff on collaborative problem solving. And one of the things he talks about is buckets. So we have a bucket, a B bucket, and a C bucket. An A bucket is where parents, I'm authoritative, there's no negotiating, and it's safety, and there's nothing we're going to do about that. B is something that we're trying to work out. C is in the bucket where it needs to be developed, but we just can't go there. Like, we can't do everything. So I think you can prioritize maybe where you want to build the skill for them, and try to be intentional about that. And then some of the other stuff, you may have to do more of it. I don't know the age of the kids, but it can feel that way. And I think you can trust your gut a little bit when you feel like, I don't need to be doing all this. I think we can trust our gut. We worked with a mother in one of our parent groups. She was talking about her son just not getting out the door on time. And he also he wanted to ride to school, right? And so you have to differentiate what was executive function and what was procrastination, because he didn't want that ride. He wanted to be able to get a ride to school. So she really worked to make sure he had the time, he had a clock with everything he needed to do. He knew his routine. There was a list. It was crystal clear that he could do it. And then she finally said, tomorrow I'm not taking you to school. You're going to walk, and I have my coat and my boots laid out, and I'll walk with you to make sure you get there the first time. But she was confident at that point that his executive functions could support him. So I think you sometimes pause and do a gut check, and it's not easy. It's not easy.
Let's see. The next question is from Allison. It says, I've known my son has ADHD since kindergarten. He's in 7th grade now. What do I need to look out for as he ages? What is the outlook for high school, college, young adults, then adults?
Hmm. So I think you keep looking out for where his executive functions aren't supporting him. Kids, in my experience, kids that are successful in college, figured out time management, they can ask questions and get help. They really understand themselves. They understand their ADHD. They'll advocate for themselves. And most of them that are successful will take medication. In high school, it's the same thing. I think you have to watch for the anxiety. You just have to watch for how they're adjusting and how they're managing what they have to manage. And you continue to talk about it with them and be a safety net. And some kids, with some support, and if they're good advocators, they get through it without a whole lot of trouble.
All right. Let's see. We'll do one more and then we can maybe get
Okay.
a few for a little later too. Last one is, if one of the parents is diagnosed with ADHD or executive functioning, how might this influence the child learning patterns from them?
Yeah, I didn't really, ADHD is the most hereditary thing besides height. So it's likely that, there is a parent. And so there's a couple different ways to look at that. I think parents, if you struggle with the same thing and haven't kind of looked at it in yourself, look at it for yourself. Get some help around it, because that can make a really big difference. For some kids that I've seen in families with a parent with ADHD, they also share a bond and they can share kind of working on it together. And there's an understanding about it. There's good and bad about having a parent with similar executive function weaknesses, because sometimes then it's, things can fall through the cracks more. But on the other hand, there can be an understanding and compassion that's needed, because it's also hard for a parent with really good executive functions to get some of these executive function weaknesses. So, but sometimes it's also propels parents to look at it in themselves, which can be a good thing. Okay, so we'll have some more time for questions. I want to talk a little bit about working memory. Remember, that's just, they have trouble keeping in mind. So we have to reduce the demands or, get it externalized. So, having a luggage tag of everything they need in the bag, better yet, like if they have a hockey bag, if you have a picture of everything they need, it's a visual glance of what they need. Kids often need guided notes or hard copy notes, because note taking, even though a lot of it's done electronically, can be hard working memory wise to remember what the teacher's being said and write. Sometimes printing things out from the computer for the kids to reference rather than switching screens can be helpful. Sarah Ward talks about being a future thinker, which is really stopping and seeing myself go through the space and what I'm going to do. So I tried this for myself when I went to the grocery store, and I needed 3 things. I needed milk, Ziploc bags, and butter. Pretty boring, but that's what I needed. So I walked through the route of the store before I went. I knew I was going to need to go down. I was going to go to the back of the store and get milk. I was going to go over a few more rows, come back up and get the Ziploc bags. I would go over a couple more, go down and get the milk or the butter. So sure enough, I got my milk and Ziploc bags, and I'm standing there in front of them. And I'm like, what was that 3rd item? And I could rehearse how I'd gone through it, and I remembered I needed it. So kids, or younger kids particularly, this can kind of be a game to stop. I'm going to go upstairs. I'm going to go down the hall. I'm going to go in the bedroom. I'm going to brush my teeth. Like, you can walk through it, because in the moment you want them to be able to access, what they need. Using color for working memory is huge. So chunking information. If you've got the 3 divisions of government, have each one on a different color. If you're comparing information, do some different color. Highlighting information that they're having trouble. If they're having trouble remembering the H when they're spelling Afghanistan, have them practice it in a different color. Flashcards, a couple different ways to do these if they'll make them, but sometimes you can make them with them, is to divide them even out in colors, because they might remember that was a red word and now I only have 4 to bring up in my head. Adding pictures to flashcards is huge for memory.
and have the kids pick the color or the picture. I was working with a client that had waiting was one of his words. And I'm like, okay, what do you think of when waiting? I'm sitting in a movie theater. I mean, to him, that was waiting. So it's what the kids visualize in their head can be helpful. This desktop helper from Really Good Stuff is like this, it's just this kind of reference sheet that they can use for some things that their working memory may not be able to help them remember. It's just kind of a quick glance. What was that? And that might be helpful. Again, using pictures. So this was a student that had to do a speech. He did a speech on John Deere, and he had to memorize this whole page. Like, it was a pretty long speech. And so we just did pictures of like groups of sentences. And then we put each kind of group on a different sheet of paper, and he was able to memorize this. And again, like having the kids pick the pictures. So he went to Middlebury College, and the church was that he got married. The 1,000 was 1,000 plows, but this minus and plus was his first wife died and he remarried. So I said to him, what do you want for that? And he goes, a minus and a plus sign, but it's like, and then he had this memorized. Like, he could remember the 2 or 3 sentences around being a mayor if we could just prompt it a little bit. Checklists can be great, and you can laminate these so they can keep, checking them off. And sometimes this is built a step at a time. This isn't always, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are using this, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. This is a checklist more by time of day, and we timed it so that, and we had these labeled. I should have gotten a picture of it, but like each of these was, get dressed. They were going to exercise a little bit, or, we would label this clock. This was when they're going out the door, stop sign. Like, where am I going? What do I need? Or if they're coming in, what do I need to put away? It's that in the moment reminder. Graphic organizers can be really helpful study tools. And this is the website that can even show you how to make them. But basically, you're putting a term or a concept, and then you flip it up and there's your answer. So it's, there's different ways to make it. So it's a study guide, as well as helping them divide out the information. And they'll need help doing this at first. Like, this won't come naturally to them. And a lot of kids don't know how to study now because it's just all electronic. And I always just encourage you to say, if they want to do, if they're upset about maybe how they did, well, can we just try this one thing and see if it makes a difference? Because kids can feel like they're going to have to do something for the rest of their life. And you don't want to set it up like that. You just want to set it up like, let's give it a shot and see what happens. I'll do it with you. Remember, we always have to frame time. And so a time timer, the red goes down, this red passes. So that can be used in lots of different ways. There's waterproof clocks in the shower. You can use a set of music if they're not going to dance and get really distracted about it. So, when this music set is over, you got to be out of the bathroom, you got to be out of your room. Alarms on devices, again, with the warnings for the transitions. And you can draw on a faced glass clock or glass face clock. So what this would be is like if we started at 12:15 and he has to be done by 12:30, you shade in the part that is the work time. And then as this comes down, they can see time has passed. Remember that time blindness is so important. So all kids don't think out as long as adults. Adults think out to 12 weeks. When there were some things on my calendar that we were doing outside of our home, I could kind of let you know for the next 3 months what I had going on, people that might visit, birthdays I'm going to remember. Like, I could pull that up so that I'm preparing for it. But kids aren't like that. So middle school kids think out maybe 1 to 2 days. High school kids maybe a week. And so if something's due in 2 or 3 weeks, that feels like next year to them. And it won't really come into their thinking, their time horizon, until maybe 1 or 2 days out, and it may be too late. So that's why it's really important to have a monthly calendar for them. and they need their own monthly calendar. I know a lot of families have a family calendar so kids can know what everybody's doing, which is fine, but it can get a little too cluttered if you're not careful. So this would be an example of a high school kid who would put down their tests, and they can color code if they want. If there's family things going on, if there's something for their religion class that they're going to do, maybe there's a sleepover, they're in dance, so that they can see how everything fits together. Because you are aware that after a dance competition weekend, she has a science project and a history test. But she's not going to be aware of it to prepare for it necessarily. This can be done once a week on Sunday night. Pull out your monthly calendar. What do you know about school? This is what I know you've got going on, and it can get filled out once a week. It can be helpful to look at time again in time increments. So if this kid really wants to watch the Twins game, we got to plan for that. Like, when are you going to get your homework, and when can you study, and when do you have things going on? The other thing that can be helpful for this is that kids can feel like all they're doing is homework, where really if they get to work for an hour, they'll have more time in their evening. I think that for some kids, they only need to see one day at a time. You can use a whiteboard and put these times in permanent marker and then fill it in. Often kids like to know what's going on, and you know what's going on maybe, but it's helpful to talk to them about it. I had a mom that did that kind of a framework for time on a whiteboard, and she got that tape. And he plans out his day, on a whiteboard. There's also planners that do the same thing for older kids if you can get them to use them. They all find it really helpful. Maintaining the system is always a little bit tricky. The other thing that can be helpful, and this can be really helpful for teachers, is to have kids estimate how long something's going to take. I think it'd be great if for assignments, part of the assignment was, how long do you think it's going to take? How long did it take you? Because they don't often estimate that well, and helping them understand how long it's going to take, or if it took a lot longer, did you totally get distracted, or did it just really take you that long, can be helpful. This is a strategy, again, from Sarah Ward for project planning. So what does it mean to break a project up into steps? This is what it means. You can take a manila folder and make like a calendar like I've made, or you could put these Post-it notes on their monthly calendar if they have a big monthly calendar on the wall. Basically, this was an assignment. It was actually an assignment of a kid that went to Groves. They had to do a cereal box kind of book report. So they had to get a book and read it, and then each side of the box had something about the book. So they had to draw a character, and they had to describe it and talk about the author, and each side of the cereal box was about the book. And it was a really creative project. So what we did was we broke up every step. So each of these orange Post-it notes is a step. So he had to pick the book, and he had to check with the teacher. Then he figured he would be able to read 50 pages 4 different times. So within a week, he would have his book read. And actually, the way we do this is you start at the end. So it was due on the 20th. The night before, he wanted to be practicing. He's busy on Wednesday nights, so he wanted to have the front done on Tuesday. Over the weekend, he would do his side panels and writing and the back description. And then he would figure out reading. And he knew that he had scouts on Tuesday nights, or Thursday nights were busy for him. So that's how you plan it out. The nice thing about this is, if you have all these Post-it notes, they kind of realize, I can't do them all. Like, it's a lot of Post-it notes on 1 or 2 days if I don't spread it out. And then if it doesn't get done, you can move it to another day, because part of the metacognition that's so important is the self-evaluation stage of the day. How did it go? What did I get done? What do I have to carry for the next day? And I think what's important when you're building that as parents and teachers is that kids don't often want to say they didn't get everything done, because then that's the whole discussion about all of that. What you want them first to do is just to say, I got 2 of the 4 things done. Okay, we got to move them to another day. And then the discussion can be, how can we help you get that done? But you want him to be able to be honest and evaluate it for themselves without feeling bad. So again, like if they don't get it done, you can move these Post-it notes to when are you going to get that done? Okay, motivation. I think motivation is one of the hardest things sometimes to get to with the kids that I coach. And I think that helping them find the reason they're going to do it and sticking with it is so important. And remember, when I need motivation is when I have to do something I don't want to do. And so we'll see motivation for what's interesting, but we won't see it for what's non-preferred. Sometimes just changing something can help. So sometimes if they can read any book they want and they start a book that's boring, have them change the book. Like, don't have them plow through it if they have a choice. Can we shorten the steps so that it looks doable? Can they work in a different setting? And that's the hard thing about online school right now, is we don't have that necessarily. Can they work with somebody else? Can they find a reward that will help them motivate? The intrinsic rewards is what we want, right? We want them to feel pride and relief and you know, responsible. But sometimes the extrinsic things are what we have to do. It was interesting. I talked to a client today. He's in high school, and we were talking about motivation. And the reason he really likes to do things is because he can get to tech time. But I said, how do you feel when you get something like done and crossed off your list? He goes, well, it's done. You know, I'm glad it's done. And I said, do you feel less stress? He goes, it depends. If I was able to do it well and I get a good grade, then I don't. But if I wasn't, then it's just more stressful for me. So, you know, like, I'm from a place where I can cross something off a list. I'm like, yay, but that's not always what drives these kids. And getting to that is what's tricky. And sometimes they just have to work when they are so bored with it, but really acknowledge how hard that is for them, because it really is. So sometimes extrinsic rewards, you know, younger kids, you can have a list of rewards, and, you know, it's kind of a surprise jar. It can be activities. It can be, you know, lots of different things, whatever drives them. Sometimes it's taking things away is a motivator, but more often than not for these kids, it's earning something. What I want us to remember is whatever the reward is, you have to keep it visual, and you need to print a picture of it, or they have to have a visual reminder of it. Younger kids, you could get full sheet magnet paper and put a picture of it, cut it up in the amount of pieces they have to do to earn it, and they could put the picture together. Remember the timeline. So don't have kids be working for something at the end of the quarter without real weekly check-ins, or even, you know, a 2-week window will be too long unless we're breaking it up. They can earn a piece of the reward. And so this was a kid that was going to earn a skateboard if he did this activity 20 times. He had to write in his planner, complete the checklist, estimate time, and show the parents the work. And you never do 20 times in a row, because they'll miss one. So when, you know, he would just X this out, and when it was clean, when it was done, he could get it. This is an example of keeping a reward visual. This kid was going to earn a pasta night with his dad if he practiced his spelling, technology, and drum. So when he crossed that off, so he kept the thing visual. I had a student that really liked to watch this cartoon before he went to school. And if he could get everything done, he would have time for it. And so we put a little note, right, like a picture of that cartoon right by his alarm clock when he woke up. So in the moment, that's what I'm working for. You have to kind of keep it visual. Just please remember that, you know, not getting something done doesn't mean they don't want to get it done. And this whole motivation piece and not getting it done is where, if we're not careful, kids can feel shame. They can feel bad about who they are, and they're going to avoid that as well. They're going to avoid dealing with it because they feel so bad. I had a student today I was working with. I almost went to tears. She had talked with the teacher last week at conferences. Teacher was super helpful. come into my office hours on Thursday. I'll help you before the test. I'm working with her at 5 o'clock today. And she just went white. I forgot to go into my office hours with my teacher. And she had written it in her planner, but we didn't get the reminder right. And I felt so bad for her because she felt so bad about herself in that. And that's what we have to protect. And it was a time that her executive functions let her down. And so we let the teacher know, and we try again and we figure out the system to help. But it's really important to try. And I know it's exhausting and discouraging as parents, but that's what is important to try. I'm going to go through the next set really, quickly. You're going to get these handouts and get this information, and then we can move to some questions. But I just want to tell you that learning wise, it's that there are some subjects these kids are going to really struggle with because of executive function. These kids can also have learning disabilities: reading, math, written expression. 65% of these kids have written expression difficulties. And so you may need to get additional testing, additional help. Groves has great, their learning center is fabulous to support kids with these executive functions and tutors and, testing and wherever you go. But I think it's important. I think written expression, I just want to reiterate, can be really challenging. So kids can have all kinds of ideas. So you can have a kid that has to write, talk about a walk he went on with his dog, and he can tell you all about the dog running after the squirrel and splashing and licking, and he can go on and on and on. When you get the pen to paper, my dog ran fast. And it looks like, he doesn't have any of these ideas. So it's an executive function problem. So brainstorm ideas with them. Facilitate narrowing a topic, because some of these kids, an open-ended topic is a recipe for disaster. You can write the ideas down for them, put them on a whiteboard, and then they can see their ideas. If they have an essay test, they should be able to have a scrap piece of paper to dump their ideas. You can, put in red, like thesis and topic sentences, or highlight things that need worked. Sometimes, sentence prompts. Like if you have to analyze a story, somebody, what wanted to do something, but so, I was working with a student that had to write a paragraph about music, and I knew he was just stuck. I knew he played piano. And so I said, when did you start playing piano? He told me all about when he started in 2nd grade and, who his teacher was. And I said, what did you like about playing the piano? He said, it really, like from the beginning, I just loved it. And sometimes it could help calm me. And he would tell me about practicing. And I said, well, what else do you remember? He didn't know anything. And then I said, well, did you ever have recitals? Well, he told me like 5 sentences about his recitals. So he had the information. We just had to dump it, and then he could organize it. Mind mapping software can be really helpful. You can mind map your ideas, and then sometimes they'll go straight into an outline form, which is really cool because then you have your paragraphs right there to write about. The writing revolution, there's free templates online. So just if written expression is challenging, you gotta break it down for them. This is a royal order of adjectives that you can just find online, but it helps them figure out, like sheepdog, I can go the size, it's big, it's old, it's English. It helps give some descriptive words to something to expand sentences. Math challenges, it's really hard sometimes for some kids to hold everything in their math. So math in their mind, their working memory. So number lines or, fact grids. Using large square graph paper can really help kids line it up. Drawing out a visual can be helpful. This is an example of that. You can see this when you get your notes. What's interesting here is the green, yellow, and red. The green is where you would start. Yellow and red, like that's the order that you would go in. You can also do it for division. These are actually on whiteboards already done through that really good stuff. So the red goes with these factors. This is a math operation terms list. So again, you'll get this on your handout, but they may not know, what per is in a story problem. And so that would be division. it might help them identify what the word is and what they have to do. That's a way of accessing working memory, of dumping it out, and then they can use it. And reading is tricky, so you have to take notes, draw pictures on strips of papers for readers. And I think teachers try to help them do this, but it can be pretty important. So I think overall, and then we'll take some questions, and I have just a couple to finish up. I think what you have to decide for your kids, is it a skill deficit or a performance deficit? Do they know how to do it? And sometimes they don't. You know, sometimes they don't know how to use a planner. They don't know how to take notes from reading. They don't know really how to make flashcards. Then you have to teach that. If they know how to do it, and oftentimes ADHD is a performance problem, they don't do what they know, we have to begin to modify the environment. So that's cues in the moment, externalizing it, where am I going to do work, and those kinds of things that you've been doing. Also know that at the end of the day, their executive function tank is depleted. When they've had to inhibit all day and manage their time and organize, it's challenging. And so what helps build that up is a little glucose ingestion. Their brain glucose is low. So some Gatorade, lemonade can be helpful. Exercise is huge. Visualizing and relaxing, and taking some breaks between tasks and being as positive as you can. The online learning we know is tricky, and I'm not really gonna, you can look at this when you go home. I'm sure you've been trying all of these things. So those are some ideas, and you can read tomorrow about the exercise, and sleep becomes important, the research about nutrition, and medication. So I think I'll stop and answer some questions if there's questions. Are there more questions?
Yes, we do have quite a few questions that have come in. First, I think I'll start with Liz's question. It says, would you talk a little bit about the ADHD and anxiety link?
So there's two links really, and from my understanding, and so one is the anxiety you feel when you are treading water all the time and can't keep up. So I'm on that hamster wheel, I can't get anywhere. And so kids that live with executive dysfunction all the time, and they go to school planning to have a better day and they don't, or they get up and get on their computer to work at home and then nothing gets done, that's anxiety producing, and it's stress producing, and they worry, and they, and that's hard. There's also anxiety that is worry, that's underlying, that's generalized, and they don't regulate either one very well, because really to manage emotions you have to have this self-regulation system. So some of the anxiety is rooted in the dysfunction that the executive function causes generally in life, or sometimes socially for kids, they're off socially in that because of their executive functions, or sometimes they have genuine like generalizing anxiety that's diagnosed. So they are very interlinked, but sometimes when the executive function stuff gets calmed down, or I've seen kids when they've gone on meds for their executive function, their anxiety kind of goes down, because it was mostly around the dysfunction in their life.
All right, next question is from Killian. It says, I have some issues with Zoom as I have ADHD as well as my children. Any help with keeping focused on Zoom? It's a very timely question.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard. I think that really one of those little timers, or setting a little timer to check in with yourself. I mean, you just have to kind of prompt yourself. I don't know what, I mean, if your mind is going elsewhere, sometimes talking out loud to yourself and working out loud to yourself and kind of talking verbally. I mean, unless you're on a call where people are, I mean, I guess with Zoom, if you're not just watching something, it's a challenge. I mean, if people are going somewhere else on their computer, there are apps that you can block, like the self-control app or Focus Me app. You can block certain sites for an hour, which might be helpful. Yeah, it's really hard. There's no magic bullet there, sorry.
Similar topic. Do you have any apps that you find helpful as tools to support any of the aspects of executive functioning, timers, organizers, etc.? And another person asked a very similar question about the reward part of it as well. Any like apps or devices that are helpful with that?
Yeah, and the challenge with some of the organizing apps is they still have to use them. They still have to go in and look at them. And so I think the apps can be great for reminders. And some kids have used different habit building apps, you know, but they have to use them. And I think, you know, I think my experience is it's great to have stuff electronically for them to look at, but there isn't anything sometimes better than an external paper calendar or list, because if they're not looking at it, it's not helpful. I have, you know, mindfulness is really helpful both for parents and kids. And so there's some good mindfulness apps to help stop and breathe. But I think you just have to try them and then remind yourself to use them is the key. But, you know, I mean, there's a lot out there. I can't keep up with them all. So, you know, I mean, it does. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay. And then for the people that have more than one child,
Wow.
It says, how do you offer rewards to your ADHD child and not your other children? How do you avoid the jealousy factor?
Yeah, I think that's tricky because you are rewarding for things that they should do. But I raised a couple kids, and I mean, I think every child has a growth area. It's just different. It may just not be around executive function. It may be another growth area. And so you might stop and think about that. I also think this needs to be explained to kids and to siblings. They need to understand it. And there's some, on my bibliography, there's some books, you know, for kids, or there's a couple great books for teenagers that teenagers kind of have written. So I think explaining it and talking about it. But I know it's tricky.
There's one question from Dana about how, just in general, it's like, how do you start talking to your kid about ADHD?
So it depends on the age, but I think it's all about the brain. So there's a part of your brain that helps you stop. There's a part of the brain that's kind of the brake system. So you have an engine that just goes and goes, but the brakes don't work as well. Or there's a part of your brain that helps you remember. And sometimes it's forgetting. So we have to trick our brain. We have to work with our brain. I think it's all kind of brain based. They understand it themselves. Like, it's not going to surprise them that they're having these, struggles, or they're getting feedback from people about it. So the more you learn it, I show kids a famous list of famous people with ADHD. There's a lot of really successful people with ADHD. They're just doing what they love and have figured out the time management a little bit. So, I think it's just trying to normalize it a little bit. There's some good little videos out there, that can explain it.
Sounds good. There's a few different questions around screen time. First one, what is your advice if screen or electronic time is their motivator? How much should this be encouraged or limited for a middle schooler? And there was another similar question about electronics always being the motivator for the kid, and how do you maybe motivate them to, find another interest as well?
Yeah, I mean, I just really empathize with parents today around the screen time. I think there's a couple of things you have to really talk with your kids about. The one is, a lot of the screen time is their social connection. I mean, it was their social connection even before COVID. So the kids play with other kids and they're playing with their friends. And now with COVID, it's kind of even more so to some degree. I think what we have to understand, and this is what you need to have the kids explain to you, is that to pull out of a game that they're in with their friends, that's a team game, or that they're all playing together, leaves everybody kind of stranded. So there's this social pressure to it as well, besides just the drive that they like. And so I think that all of that has to just be understood, and that the kids get you understand that. Given that, there have to be limits. And I'm wondering if you can work with your kids, like how long does it take you kind of to play a game? So you can sit down and you're going to have to learn not to start another game, or you are going to have to pull out of it. And there can be a clock and a reminder there. Or is it that they earn time to play at a bigger block later in the week? So we'll let you sit down and play for 3 hours at a time, but you're going to have to earn that time. I think it's very difficult. It is the draw. Some of these kids get hooked into it, and you really have to get help around that. They can't regulate it. I don't know about other rewards for, getting, as much as you can get kids involved in something else or volunteer somewhere, that's always good for kids, but that's a little tricky now, but it's hard. But try to understand it from your kids' perspective too, and see if you can problem solve it together a little bit. This is the time we're going to allow, or this is what has to get done first. And now, it is nice, but parents can just even switch things on and off, which can help too. But it's complicated. Try to kind of work at it with them the best you can.
All right. Next question. My 11-year-old daughter often answers with an "I don't know" shrug when asked how she felt about a certain social situation. Thus, it's hard for me to understand what she thinks emotionally about a lot of social situations, such that I can help and/or direct her about how to react next time. She has been diagnosed with ADHD, inattentive, and EFD. So is this a typical scenario?
It can be. The social piece can be really hard for some of these kids. They don't pick up the social cues, and it's heartbreaking. I mean, it's hard. That's the hardest thing. I think that's one of the tough things. They're just not reading the social cues. And I work with them a little bit, but not a lot. The social thinking stuff from Michelle Garcia Winter's good. There are some people that kind of work just with that. I think trying to, if she can read the cue and just is impulsive about it, can she have some kind of a reminder? Can she wear a wrist, some kind of a wristband or a bracelet that would remind her to stop, or remind her to whatever she needed to do socially? So you can do something like that. That would, if she's able to do that. But it is really hard. I think reading some of the social thinking, some of those books can be helpful with kids. It's tricky, but again, just keep kind of talking to her about and what you notice, but they aren't always aware. That's the hard thing. The metacognition isn't always there. And so it's hard you have to kind of teach it, it's difficult, I know.
There is one question here about medication. It says, what are some medications for executive functioning, if any? My 12-year-old is on meds for ADHD, but struggles with EF as well.
Well, the meds for ADHD should improve the executive functions. They won't improve them all, but you should see some improvement with some of the executive functions. So medication should help kind of that impulsivity, focus, and getting started, which should kind of help everything else. The question is, are the meds wearing off? Do you have the right dose? Do you have the right med? Because you should see some improvement with those. Not 100%. That's where you need some of the strategies.
Okay. And from Allison, it says, what about the middle child who not only is the middle child, but is also between two siblings with ADHD and dysgraphia? She always has to wait or do things herself. She gets forgotten about because she's the easy one.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, again, can you take her for a walk or something and ask her about that? I think we all have these experiences when we're validated about them. Sometimes we understand that. Like I think we underestimate kids' ability to understand that if they're seen and if they're validated.
And then how can you be intentional about connecting with her for sure? But that, you know, I would encourage you just to have the talk with her about it and how she feels about it. And if she can be honest with you, then you'll know and can kind of work with her on it.
Let's see, a question from Barb related to sleep. She says, I think you may have said this, but is ADHD commonly linked to sleep issues?
Yes.
My son is always a great sleeper, but ever since we started hybrid school in person twice a week, he can't fall asleep the night before those days. He's in middle school.
Well, yes, sleep is a, it's so important for our executive functions to work. You know, when I haven't gotten a good night's sleep, I'm not, you know, my executive functions don't work as well. Plus, a lot of these kids can have definitely sleep disorders. So sometimes they have trouble getting to sleep, like your son, or sometimes they're waking up. I think all of the sleep hygiene things is what we can do the best we can. Some kids are on melatonin to help. I would try to get to what's going on. Like, I'm curious about what it is about right before the hybrid days that he doesn't want to go to sleep. I mean, that there's something there, and can you problem solve any of that? Yeah.
Let's see here. Kristen has a question about math. It says, as far as working memory, what are some good strategies for remembering or retaining math facts?
Some of it's just as much as they can remember and rote memory. There's times, what is that? Times tables, I can email it. They're cards that have a picture with the math facts. So like 4 by 4 is 16. It sort of has this 4 by 4. I mean, it's a drawing with it. Sometimes, depending on the age of the kids, they have to be able to use a calculator. They have to use a math grid because they really are going to have trouble remembering it. And there's kids that can do higher level math that just can't remember their math facts. And at some point, and I've had discussion with math teachers about that. When I was at the school, we would kind of, we would talk about that because it's kind of a hard thing to know. You want them to know it. But yeah, it can be hard. I think do the memory work that you can. I think they can get anxious about it too. So if you can just have them, or if they can say it out loud to themselves, verbally hearing it, even if they can go 4 by 4, like if they've practiced it like that, they might be able to pull it up.
Okay. Amy has a question, going back to the idea about lists and reminders to do things. If you make a list of all the things that need to be done, for example, as my 11-year-old gets ready for school, how detailed should you be? I could write out 2 pages of very detailed information.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that I guess I'd need to see that list. Is there anything that can go off of it? And can you use a picture of what, rather than a list, like a picture of everything she needs on? Shoes. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what's all on the list. Yeah, you can't have that. She won't respond to a list that long. And you may have to break up the piece that she's independent. I don't know how old your daughter is, and be able to help do the rest of it. And I think the other thing that's about lists, this is really interesting. I had a high school kid once. I'm like, what is the deal about making a list? He goes, why would I put everything down that I don't want to do? And it's so profound. It's exactly right. So I think that you have to figure, I think particularly in mornings, I didn't mention this, try to limit your transitions. If you're upstairs and get dressed and you come downstairs and eat and you go up to brush your teeth and you're down, like try to just consolidate how many times you have to go in the bathroom and how many times you have to go places, because just, brush your teeth downstairs if you can or something. Really try to consolidate transitions might help.
Okay. Rachel has a question. I've found that extrinsic or intrinsic rewards are really hard to identify with for my 10-year-old when faced with an uninteresting task like homework. It's like he can't focus on the reward and has said that he needs to, quote, get upset to finish something. Do you have advice on metacognition around talking through this?
That's a really interesting observation from your son, that he has to get upset to get through it. It's like he has to get
he has to get like physiologically going. Yeah, I mean, I'd have to know more about that, I think, before I could really, I'd want to know more about that before I can really, I think, answer that question. That's, I mean, yeah, that's just,
Yeah.
I would need to know more about that. There, yeah.
Let's see here. Barb is wondering, my son was diagnosed with mild ADHD, but does that get more severe as they get older? You mentioned it could it could be almost 30 years old before they outgrow, if they outgrow it.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it all depends on the situation and their skills and the environment they're in, the teachers they have, you know, what's expected, what they're interested in. So everybody's course is different, and it ebbs and flows. So things are going to go well. You might hit a little bump, you know, so.
Okay. And then another one popped up, kind of going back to the math question. Marcy was wondering, regarding the kid that can't remember math facts due to ADHD, yet has tested into a higher level math class, should they drop back to a lower level?
Yeah, that's, I don't think so. I mean, I think I think they need to get support for their executive function delay. I don't think they're going to do, I've seen kids not do any better in a lower math level, because the problem isn't that it isn't bad, it's getting the work done. And I think you have to work with the teachers on that and work with your disability people.
Yeah. And then our final question from Rebecca, it says, is medication required to make these strategies more effective in most cases?
The research on medication is that 70 to 90% of the cases are really improved on it, and 50% of kids can be normalized if they're on the right med with the right, then can manage, you know, you manage side effects. So it is, the research shows it's a fundamental piece to consider in treating kids. Yeah.
All right, well, that is all the questions that have come in.
Okay, well, if anybody's still with us, I had a couple more slides to finish. I just want to acknowledge that parenting is very stressful and it can impact a lot, but there can also be some great moments of joy and celebration. I think when you can change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And I think one of the things I encourage you guys to do is to think about goals rather than expectations. Have a goal that your child can get out the door in the morning. Don't expect it, because when we expect it, it should be. And it gets really frustrating when it's not. So try to look shoulder to shoulder with your child to problem solve things and figure things out with them the best you can. And I just want to tell you that I had a high school student who had been in a lot of conflict with their mom that said, you know, Mom, I feel like they'd gotten to a point where it was better. And she said, I feel like I'm building an arch. And if you can stay steady and support me while I'm doing that, then when one of my bricks falls off, I can get it replaced. But if you start getting all upset, then the whole thing crumbles. And I thought her description of it was pretty profound. And I just want to tell you that I've had more, I mean, I have a lot of stories of kids, you know, they get there. And I have a student graduating from college at 24. It's taking him a little time. And I remember his mom would call me when he was like 20 and she'd go, he's acting like he's 16. Oh yes, he is 16 sometimes developmentally, but it's that perspective. She had such humor, you know, about it. And I know that isn't always easy, but kids do get there. And I encourage you to see your kids for who they are and realize you're in it for the long haul. Take care of yourself a little bit. And if I can help, let me know. I do mindful parenting groups, and we talk in small groups of parents about this and how to navigate it. So if that's a, you know, help, let me know. Thanks for your time. And if you have any other questions, I'm happy to, you know, field them the best I can.
Thank you so much, Judy. This has been a great workshop. So many great questions. If you have any more, please send those in, and I can pass them on to Judy as well. You will be getting an email tomorrow. It'll have all of the slides from tonight and some helpful links as well as some handouts from Judy. So if you have any other questions, just let us know, and I hope everybody has a great night. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you. Take care.